Africa today, and I'm substituting. I'm George Miller, the Vice President for Administration and Finance. It's my role to introduce the platform party to you now. On your far left, we have Dr. Charles Reagan, who is the chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Next is Mr. Edward Seaton, who is a Landon Patrons Chairman and also the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Mercury. On your far right, we have Mr. Ken Heinz, who is a student body president. Next, we have Dr.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce a fellow media colleague, particularly one so much more attractive than most of the old goats that I have to deal with on a daily basis. I think it is very appropriate today to have Lesley Stahl, the CBS White House correspondent, as our 67th Landon lecturer, especially at this time immediately following a presidential election with all of the ramifications and White House implications that has. Ms. Stahl has been covering the White House for CBS for almost 6 years. She went to the White House beat after serving as Washington co-anchor of the CBS Morning News. She also has been moderator of Face the Nation since September of last year. As a White House correspondent, she covered the recent Reagan campaign in its entirety and has covered stories throughout his presidency, including his trips, the economic summit and others, has covered the budget process and the continuing economic story from the perspective of the White House. She also covered the attempt on President Reagan's life at the Washington Hilton in 1981. During the administration of President Carter, Ms. Stahl had among her assignments the Iranian hostage story, the Camp David Accords, and the economic summit in Venice. She also reported on President Carter's campaign organization and re-election efforts in 1980 and served as regional correspondent on the West Desk of the CBS News Campaign 80 election night coverage. Election night 1984, she covered the U.S. House races. Ms. Stahl joined CBS News in 1972 as a Washington-based reporter and was named a correspondent in 1984. While she was on general assignment in Washington, she reported on the events surrounding the Watergate break-in and the subsequent hearings of the Senate Select Committee, as well as the House Judiciary Committee hearing on impeachment. A native of Swampscott, Massachusetts, she came to CBS from WHDH-TV in Boston, where she was a reporter from 1970 to 1972. She is a 1963 graduate of Wheaton College and is married to Aaron Latham, an author. The couple has a daughter, Taylor. Ms. Stahl, we are proud to welcome you to the Landon Lecture Podium.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yes? Am I standing too close? You know, I do work with microphones every day, but whenever I get up to a podium, especially when there are three pointing right at me, I am always reminded of a true story. CBS News hired a very distinguished reporter from, I'll tell you what newspaper, but I'm not going to tell you his name because it's not fair, from the New York Times. Ooh, see? From the New York Times. And his first day on the job, a major story broke on Capitol Hill. Maybe they had just picked a new majority leader. I don't know. But they hadn't had time to train this New York Times reporter on how to work with a camera and how to work with a microphone. They just sent him right up to the Senate to interview the main suspect of the case, if you will. And so he, never having worked with equipment, took the microphone, asked the senator the important question, and as the senator began answering, he took the microphone, put it under his arm, whipped out his notebook, and began to take notes. So if I fade or if I'm too close, let me know. I'm having trouble seeing some of you in the back, but wave your hand, say I can't hear you. It is a great honor to be asked to be a Landon lecturer. Alf Landon, as you all know, ran for president in 1936, but now today he is a true folk hero, an elder statesman of the Republican Party, and every time a major issue comes up, I know some reporter, national reporter, commentator is coming to Topeka to find out what Alf Landon has to say, what his views are on the issues. I was told that Mr. Landon is listening to me right now on radio, and I'm also told that as sure as I'm standing here, Alf Landon will be rebutting whatever I have to say at some point very shortly. So I'd like to say hi to Alf Landon in Topeka, and sorry that he's not here today. White House correspondent for CBS News. Well, I must admit to you that it does sound very glamorous, and while I do like my job very much, I cannot tell a lie. Much of covering the President of the United States is boring. The White House press corps is virtually imprisoned in a small little shell right inside the White House. And while the press room is only a few yards away from the Oval Office, days can go by when we never see Ronald Reagan. Lack of access is a way of life. We are confined in these claustrophobic little cubbyholes. A CBS booth is, oh, I would say about 16, 17 feet long, and 5 of us work in there on a given day. We have 4 reporters and a radio technician, all crammed in this little tiny, tiny space. And what we do, and I'm just going to be honest with you, what I do most of my time is wait for one of those top officials who wishes to remain anonymous to return my phone call. Covering the White House is in fact a glorified stakeout operation. I very much feel like Cagney and Lacey in their squad cars waiting for a little peek at the suspect, you know, a little peek at Ronald Reagan, a glimpse, I mean, one little tiny shot of the Secretary of State's limousine driving onto the White House grounds, and I'm running back and saying, I got a piece for tonight, which means I've got about 10 seconds of a car driving onto the White House lawn, and then I can do a piece, assuming I can find out what he's on the White House grounds for. I was well trained for staking out. Not because I went to a police academy, but because when I started my job at CBS in 1972, I was assigned to cover Watergate. And because I was the newest reporter in the Washington Bureau, you can just imagine what kind of plum assignments I used to get. The truth is, the assignment I got was the early morning stakeouts at Haldeman's house, Ehrlichman's house, and I would get up very early and go out with a camera crew and stand in front of their homes, and as they came out to go to work, ask them a question. Staking out became such a total way of life in Washington in that time that I think at least CBS practically forgot there was another way to gather news. I can well remember the morning my phone rang about 3 o'clock, and the assignment editor, he woke me up, said, your job tomorrow is to stake out Justice Douglas. Oh my God, what did he do? No, he was about to become the justice that had served longest on the Supreme Court. And they wanted pictures of him jogging. But you know, we never called anybody up in those days and said, can we come and take pictures of you jogging? No, you just went and staked them out. And I said, okay. But when I woke up about 5:30, it was hailing out, and I could actually hear the pellets hitting the window in my bedroom. So I called in. And as I told you, I was the newest kid at the CBS Bureau, and I said to the assignment editor, you know, it's hailing out. And Justice Douglas is 70 years old. Are you sure he's going jogging? And the assignment editor talked to me like I was the biggest idiot that ever lived. And he said, everybody knows he's an outdoorsman. So he won't jog. He'll walk his dog. He'll go out. Get out there, kid. So I was out there. And the crew, of course, was angry at me because it was cold and dark. And no lights are on in the Douglas house. 7:30, 8:30. 9:30, this limousine, bigger than this hall, pulls up. Did you know that the Supreme Court justices carpool? Blackmun comes and picks up Justice Douglas in this limousine. But the limousine drives right up his driveway, practically to the front door. The justice's wife is virtually carrying him into the car because it's very slippery. And the car came down to the bottom of the hill, and I'm standing there. And we shined a light on the car, and we had umbrellas and microphones and cameras. And they pushed the electric window down. And I said, Mr. Justice, my name is Lesley Stahl, and we've been here this morning to get pictures of you jogging. And he said to me, Miss Stahl, I am 70 years old, and it's hailing out. Are you crazy? It was only a couple of months later when the bureau chief in Washington asked me if I was ready to do some live nightly analysis of the Watergate Senate hearings. So I lied and said I was ready because I was covering the hearings. So every night we would analyze what had happened that day in the hearings, and at the end of the broadcast, it was a roundtable discussion. And Dan Shore was on my left, and Dan Rather was on my right, and I was always in the middle. I think somebody thought boy, girl would be cute. Put me in the middle. And our moderator was John Hart, who was in New York. And he would always open up with a penetrating question. And one of these guys would jump out and answer it, and the other one would jump out and disagree. And that would be the roundtable. I'd never get to talk, ever. Finally, I might be able to say, yeah, right, I think that's right. The bosses said it didn't look good. Let her talk. Get it? Get it? Night after night, I would be sitting there looking, and you could hear this little wistful, but never. Finally, they were threatened. Finally threatened that if they didn't let me talk at the next roundtable, that we weren't going to do these anymore. So everybody knew I was going to get to talk, and for some incredible reason, John Hart's opening question that next night was, well, folks, I remember he clapped his hands. He went, well, folks, what's the gossip down there in Washington about L. Patrick Gray? And I did what you did. I heard the word gossip, and I said, gee, I think I'll wait and answer the next question. But the two guys, I couldn't talk. So Dan Shore, who could never tolerate a vacuum, jumped in and said on live television, well, John, if it's gossip you want, that's why we have a woman here. Oh, I was so enraged and upset. I know I talked, but I also know I made no sense. I rambled, I was trying to control my rage, also my fist, and it was terrible. The show ended, and I ran upstairs into the newsroom and I called home. Daddy, how do you write a letter of resignation? And he said, no, oh, you were great. And I said, Daddy, I was awful. I rambled, I made no sense. I finally got my big chance, and I blew it. Oh, no, you looked good, your voice was firm, your points were sharp. I mean, you're so much smarter than those guys. I remember he was one, said, Daddy, if you are not going to level with me, put Mother on the phone. And my father said, Mother can't talk right now, she's too upset. It's a little unfair because my mother did eventually pull herself together and get on the phone. And as she has always done in my life, she said, you get out there swinging, don't you resign, you come back tomorrow night, you'll be great. She was terrific. So anyway, I have covered the White House now for 6 years. As somebody said recently, I've been at the White House longer than Ronald Reagan, which is true. What I have discovered is something I think I first learned when I was in high school. And that is, just as in our little lives, in the big world of national politics and superpower relations, what really counts is personality. One must admit that Ronald Reagan is a stunningly successful leader. Thousands and thousands of people who disagree with his philosophy and his policies, and even some people who don't particularly respect his work habits, still want him to be President of the United States, still want him to lead us. So I think his appeal transcends the issues. It flows from his upbeat, positive outlook, his very confident good nature, and let's face it, his style on television. Indeed, the past election and the one before in 1980 between Reagan and Jimmy Carter have had less to do with issues and ideology than with spirit. They were about optimism versus pessimism. Together, these two elections in 80 and 84 comprise a great cross-country collective casting off of the guilt and negativism that Watergate, Vietnam, and the hostage crisis fostered in the American psyche. The elections were a national repudiation of the America is wrong, America is failing mood, and of those who, through Reagan's tireless efforts, got linked to that mood. In virtually every Reagan speech during this campaign, the so-called liberals were fingered as the culprits who brought us the melees. He called the liberals the gloom and doomers. He emphasized their negativism wherever he went, actually borrowing from a speech that UN Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick gave at the Republican Convention in Dallas when she said they, and she meant the liberals, always blame America first. The president's speechwriter, Peggy Noonan, transformed that line into the president's stump speech, the one he gave wherever he went in the campaign, as, and I quote, the blame America first crowd. On top of that, the president's TV ad showed pictures of the American hostages in Iran, certainly one of our country's most painful and humiliating chapters. Reagan's ads managed to contrast that sense of impotence with his own aura of strength. The public ate it up. I covered the campaign, and nowhere was the response to Reagan's message, I'm strong, they're weak, I'm positive, they're negative, more wildly received than on college campuses. When Reagan spoke at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, I thought that I was at a Michael Jackson concert. I had to keep turning around and look to see that it was Reagan and not some fantastic rock star. The applause was so thunderous. The faces so adoring. Now, every time a political candidate goes out and has a rally, he's going to go to a place where people like him. And they're going to rev up the crowd before. It is not that I haven't been to a million rallies. I'm telling you, I saw something different. I saw something deep and emotional, and I was impressed. And I've covered campaigns since '68, and I have never seen anything like this outpouring of love and worship that I saw at Bowling Green for Ronald Reagan. What was the power that the oldest president in our history had and probably still has over young people? I think some of you here, are you all in the back? A very brilliant political analyst named Michael Barone, who writes the Almanac of American Politics, tried to figure out what this attraction was. And he called it Are you ready? The Polavchik phenomenon. You remember Walter Polavchik, don't you? Well, when I tell you who he is, you'll remember him. Walter Polavchik was that young boy in Chicago whose parents went back to Russia and he refused to go with them. You remember, I know you do, because it was an extraordinary story that all the networks covered. Says Barone, Walter looked around him and said, hey, this is a pretty nice place. Why would anybody want to leave here? No less to go back to Moscow. Barone says that's what happened to young people all across the country. They looked around them. They saw no war, no draft. They saw an improving economy. They didn't remember Watergate and Vietnam. They did remember the hostages. In fact, that was probably their first foreign policy, awareness of foreign policy. And what they saw was a Democrat in power, with the United States being humiliated and being impotent. And now we had a president who talked about strength and a positive outlook on life. Anyway, the young people, according to Barone, were very much attracted to Reagan's very unashamed, proud patriotism. It appealed to them and what they wanted out of their lives. And in fact, and the truth is, it appealed to most people in the country. And it even appealed to women. When it was all over, a majority of women voted for Ronald Reagan. The pollster Dottie Lynch said that the gender says today, I just talked to her 2 days ago in preparation for this, she says that the gender gap is still there. For instance, women did not, and we take this from our exit polls. You know, when people left the polls, they were asked a series of questions. This is the CBS exit poll. That more women did not give Ronald Reagan credit for the economic recovery. But nevertheless, a majority of women said they felt they were better off than they had been 4 years ago, and they got swept up in the mood and good feelings about the country that Ronald Reagan seemed to embody. Lynch says that very few of Mondale's messages were positive. His greatest stroke, she says, was selecting Geraldine Ferraro because it played into the new mood, the new sense that things were going right in America, that all things are possible, that life is getting better for everyone, even women. But she says the Mondale campaign grew fearful that the Democratic Party was becoming feminized, and so Ferraro was not highlighted in those terms. The election in the end was an endorsement for the way things are now, the status quo, a hip hip hooray for the status quo. And the status quo meant Ronald Reagan in the White House, but it also meant a lot of Democrats in Congress, including liberal Democrats. The fact that so many liberals were reelected to Congress seems evidence enough that the American people were not putting a stamp of approval on Reagan's conservative agenda. Consider the issues. Most of these young people who voted for Reagan say that they're liberal on social issues. A recent CBS News New York Times poll showed that most Americans think that the president didn't do enough to bring around an arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. Another poll, this one by Gallup, shows that there's overwhelming support for increased spending on social programs in the country, and that there's support for a cutback in the military budget, and that most people really do expect that our taxes will go up. There was not the major political realignment that many of Reagan's supporters predicted. Democrats are not swinging over and becoming Republicans. Liberals are not tearing off their liberal labels and putting on conservative ones. There is instead a movement toward de-alignment, with people leaving both parties. And they're becoming independent voters, people who split their vote. And they're becoming combinations of things, liberal on social issues, but conservative on economics, or maybe conservative on foreign policy and liberal on economics. People are no longer in those very rigid, I'm a liberal, I'm conservative categories. During the campaign, a lot of the president's critics said that his campaign was shallow, that he was manipulating images, and that he wasn't addressing the issues, that it was all substance and no style. I'm going to tell you a personal story about a long report I did for the CBS Evening News about that, about who was talking about issues and who was not. The piece documented how, in fact, the president was not talking about the issues. He was not outlining a plan for his next term. He was avoiding questions about the next term. And the report documented how he was trying to actually disassociate himself from some of his own policies, trying to create some public amnesia over the ones that had become unpopular. We showed him at the Olympics for the handicapped and at an old age home, trying to take credit for these programs, and pointed out that, in fact, he had tried to cut the budget for the disabled and the elderly. It was, I'll be honest with you, a fairly tough report. And I was a little worried about the reception I'd get the next day when I went to work at the White House in my little cubbyhole. I thought, oh my God, none of those anonymous sources are ever going to call me back again. But no sooner had this report aired on the evening news than my phone rang, and it was a White House official. And instead of blasting me, he said, "Great piece, really liked it, and thanks a lot." And I said, "What?" He said, "No, we loved it. It was great." And I said, "You have to explain this to me. You want to have cold water thrown on you." This man said to me, "Oh, Lesley, the American people don't listen to what you say. They only see those great pictures of Ronald Reagan. And while you were yammering away, we saw those wonderful pictures." He said that they see the bunting and the balloons and the flags and Reagan looking healthy and talking about a positive future for the country. That's what the people want, he said, and that's all they see. Television, where the campaign was waged, turned out to be Mr. Reagan's ultimate weapon. It is, after all, a medium of impressions where personality and how one looks make a big difference. And you all heard Walter Mondale's last news conference where he blamed television for a lot of his problems. A lot of television images in the early part of Jimmy Carter's presidency contributed to a public notion that he wasn't strong, that he wasn't macho enough. He wore that sweater, for starters, you remember, in his zeal to de-imperialize the office. He seems to have ended up demasculinizing his own image. I don't know if you remember this, but in the 1980 campaign, a headline squeaked past an editor at the Boston Globe. It was a story about Carter, and the headline said, "More mush from the wimp." The title stuck. By contrast, Reagan's early TV images were extremely strong, especially after he was shot and joked about it. I'll never forget the day he left the hospital. Now, the press had not seen him for weeks. They kept putting out these still black and white photographs of him, but we had not seen him. And he walked out, and just let me remind you that Hinckley, that fellow who shot at the president, was standing with the press. So as you can imagine, we were nowhere near the president when he left the hospital. He came out a door. We were across the street and then back behind some barricades. We had these huge, gigantic lenses to see this little dot that was coming out, but we happen to have some bullhorn reporters in our press corps. You've, of course, heard of Sam. And Sam, or somebody like Sam, shouted across this huge expanse, "Mr. President, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get home?" And Ronald Reagan said, "Sit down." Oh, it was heaven. Now, all of us who were standing there and had covered Jimmy Carter turned to each other and said, "Can you imagine what Jimmy Carter would have said?" He would have said, "I'm going to read all the national security documents that I haven't been reading and the Bible in Spanish." Would have gone on forever. Believe me, we loved it. Anyway, the public felt that Reagan was a hero, and a hero with an awfully good sense of humor. Moreover, he seemed to be consistent. He talked tough. He had a great walk, winning smile. From what the public saw on television, they really liked him. You know, there's a lot of talk about the Teflon factor, and everybody keeps trying to explain it, but what I told you in the beginning, is it's not that hard. If you like somebody, if you like your friend, you forgive him just because you like him. And I think that's what's happened with the American people and Ronald Reagan. He's someone we want to forgive, so we forgive him. In fact, CBS did a poll probably about 18 months ago. I remember it because I ended up doing a report on it. And there were a lot of questions about Reagan that came out negative in this poll. People said, do you think he works very hard? And a majority said no. Do you think he has a really firm grasp of, I don't know, foreign policy? No. Do you think he understands the deepest intricacies of, tax policy? No. There were all these negatives. And then they finally got around to saying, do you think he's a good president? Yes. Do you want him to be president some more? Yes. It was all there in the poll, just what I'm saying, that the feelings that he gave us through his mood and his disposition and his outlook transcended everything else. All this emphasis on positivism, unfortunately, for those of us in the media, I think, has serious implications for the press. We reporters, as you well know, just by the nature of journalism, end up being conveyors of bad news. During the campaign, it was the press that kept reminding everyone of the ballooning deficits, that there was still a lot of unemployment in the country, that just because American troops overran a small Caribbean island called Grenada, that really didn't necessarily mean we were standing tall again. It was the press that brought back the memory of the 200-plus Marines who died in the bomb blast in Lebanon, and that Ronald Reagan's Middle East policy was in shambles. The public did not want to be reminded of those things, and as always, they blamed the messenger. But I fear a special resentment, because the press is always blamed when bad news has to be put out. But I think there is a special resentment in these days against the media, because I think that with a little help from Mr. Reagan, we are getting swept up in that repudiation of negativism and people that get linked with it. And now I sense an attitude in the public that maybe the press doesn't have a right to ask really tough questions of our leaders, that maybe the press shouldn't be delving into the bureaucracy to get information. I fear that the public is building a case against the press going about its business. Now, I am not here to defend every action and every practice of every reporter and every news organization in our country. Clearly, there have been excesses, and I think we stand to be criticized, and let's be frank, we have been criticized, and I think a lot of news organizations have taken that quite seriously. But while we talk about a free press in other countries, talk about the preciousness of it, and how we as Americans should champion it in other countries, I wonder if we have lost the appreciation for a vigilant press in our own country. I also wonder if our universities are doing enough to explain the function and the responsibility of the Fourth Estate in a democratic society. You know, there's a new government panel that just put out a report that says our colleges are failing to give students an adequate education in the humanities. The report says that faculties have caved in to vocational pressures from students. They say, the panel says, that the students are not learning enough about history, literature, philosophy, I'm quoting the report, and the ideals of the past that have shaped our society. Well, I suspect that not enough is being taught about American institutions like the press and the First Amendment. The public should understand, because they've studied American history, that all presidents end up attacking the press. We are, after all, trying to get the secrets they're trying to keep hidden. We are trying to get out information that they don't want us to get out. There is a very natural adversarial relationship between the government and the press, and that's as it should be. That is not wrong, and that is not bad. I will tell you a story about that very natural adversarial relationship. You know, I think that if you look over the landscape of presidents, that this president has a pretty good relationship with his press corps. I know he attacks us all the time, but that's natural too. That's to be expected, and I think we do expect it. But because we like him too, because he tells us, he smiles at us and wipes away a lot with a good little joke. I think that we have that same kind of personal feeling for him that everybody does. But the adversarial relationship is alive and well, and I'm just building up to this true story, which is so wonderful. You know, when he goes out to vacation in Santa Barbara, you see pictures of him horseback riding on CBS. Well, that's because when he started going there, we scouted around for a mountaintop overlooking his ranch where we could put our camera and take pictures. So the first day we found our mountaintop, we took pictures of him horseback riding, and we brought the tape back to our little office in Santa Barbara at what they call the vacation White House. And there were these little tiny ants walking around because we were so far away. So the next day we sent our crew up there with a super duper gigantic lens. And back came the tape, and there were these little mice running around. And not only couldn't you tell that any person was sitting on them, you didn't even know what those horses were. So we sent away for a gigantic, extraordinary lens. Now, I don't know the first thing about equipment, but I think it's that camera they put in Cleveland, and you can see the astronauts in the capsule down at Cape Canaveral. I think that's the lens we got. They had to build a house just to put the lens on, to rest the lens on something because it's so huge. When we got back these magnificent, gorgeous pictures, no question, it's Ronald Reagan up on a horse. Now, one of his aides told me this, but I recently heard the president tell the story himself, so it's absolutely true. He saw the pictures that night and couldn't believe that we were taking pictures of him horseback riding, and got upset, and oh my God, I can't even go horseback riding. I'm living in a bubble. This is awful. And then he stopped. He got some kind of mischievous look in his eye. He said, hey, what do you think they would do if tomorrow I go horseback riding, and when I know they've got a great shot of me, I grab my chest and fall off the horse? Oh. You know, do you want to tell me that the adversarial relationship is not alive and well? We would go nuts. Anyway, in the spirit of these times, I would like very much to end on a positive note, something that I care about, and that is just to note that this has been an extraordinary year for women. A woman walked in space, and a woman ran for Vice President of the United States, and you can't say that I'm talking negative. Thank you.
Ms. Stahl has agreed to take some questions. I believe we have microphones on both sides of the room. If there are any questions, would you please go to the microphone so we can all hear? I think we'll take questions right over here.
Make them easy.
Ms. Stahl, colleagues of yours in the print media, Alan Goodman and Charlie McDowell, have criticized the media coverage of the 1984 presidential campaign for its proliferate use of the sports metaphor. And my question is, do you believe that by covering an election campaign as though it were a horse race, the media distorts the meaning of the choices the voters make?
Well, my own view is that we very much cover what the candidates are talking about and saying. And in this campaign, as my long piece and report that I told you about the president, pointed out that he was not really talking about issues. He was talking about mood, and I think we covered his campaign from that perspective. We didn't do a lot of critical analytical pieces. Those reporters that went out with him didn't. But CBS did a lot of umbrella pieces this year. We did a lot of pieces on the issues. And I think those critics who looked at the daily reporters were not taking into account the secondary pieces that CBS did. We are criticized for that every year, every 4 years. And I think we did take that criticism to heart this time and designed our campaign coverage in a different way. I don't know how many of you religiously watch the evening news, but we almost always had a short, here's what they did, here's what they said today piece, followed by a big analytical report by someone who wasn't with the candidates day in and day out. So I don't think it really is fair when it comes to CBS. I think that, frankly, I mean, my gut feeling is that the sports metaphor does in fact apply, that it is a horse race. And as long as you're talking about the issues in some way, as we did, that to cover the campaign itself in that fashion really isn't that off the mark. It is a race.
Ms. Stahl, I was just wondering, you're around the White House on a daily basis and around President Reagan, much more than any of us would ever hope to be. I'm just curious, what is your impression? Do you believe that Ronald Reagan himself, not his advisors or his analysts, do you believe that Ronald Reagan himself sincerely believes that he can reduce our deficit without raising taxes?
Let me first off say that just because I have an office a few yards away from him does not mean I know him any better than anyone in this room. I hate to admit it. That is as difficult a question for me to answer as anybody in this room, and in fact for any of his aides to answer. I've discovered that one of the ways Reagan leads, and I do think he is a good leader, is by remaining a little aloof. You can talk to his aides and they'll say, you know, candidly and off the record, I don't know what he's going to do. This has happened a lot. He's very cagey. We just heard that they presented the tax plan to the president and he didn't respond. It wouldn't surprise me if Don Regan doesn't know what the president thinks of that huge tax proposal that the Treasury worked on for months. And that's just the way he behaves. What he does do, though, is he's above everything, and I think we tend to forget this because he is so ideological in his language. But he is above that even, a good politician. And when he knows that he's going to lose, he does tend to compromise and, in fact, cave in. And I think what he's doing is testing the waters. He's letting these stories float. And I think if he finds that he can't end up with anything that makes any kind of sense in terms of the budget without a tax increase, he'll cave in. But I think he'll fight it right up to the bitter end. But I don't know what's going on in his mind. And I don't think many, even much closer than I do, know. It's hard for me to see it.
Ms. Stahl, you mentioned a de-alignment in political parties in your speech and a more lean towards independent voting. How do you think this will affect our country in the near future?
Well, there are some people who think that unless we maintain a strong two-party structure that the whole process will fall apart. I know David Broder has written about it. I don't know. I wouldn't like to see us splinter up into 3 and 4 parties. And I don't know that we're not in a transition period in which this grouping of conservative, let's say conservative on social issues and liberal on economic and vice versa, won't form into 2 different parties that might even have the label Democrat and Republican. But I do think we're in a shifting around phase. And I don't know how it'll end up. I'm being honest with you, I really don't know.
Thank you.
Ms. Stahl, I have a question regarding exit polls. It's getting difficult to have an election night party that's not over by 8 o'clock in the evening unless it's an extremely close race. Mike Royko, the Chicago columnist, a couple of weeks ago, or about a week or 2 before the election, said that the best way to handle exit pollsters is to lie to them. Many people in this country are, I think, upset and angered at the kind of intrusion that the media has on our right to vote and to wait for the results. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I have absolutely no intention of becoming the world's leading champion of exit polls. So you're not going to hear a lot, but I will tell you the theory or philosophy behind or what the press argument is. And that is the notion that whatever we know, you should know. That we do not stand apart from the public. That we are not some force halfway between officialdom and the people. That in fact we're with the people. So that the theory is if we know it, you should know it. We shouldn't keep anything from you. And that was the whole argument during the Pentagon Papers. If we knew it, you should know it. There shouldn't be things that we don't publish or broadcast because we're you. And that's such the central philosophy of the Fourth Estate, that anything that deviates from that becomes very difficult. So if we know it at 8 o'clock, you should know it at 8 o'clock. And that is the philosophy.
If I could ask a follow-up question.
And also, you know, if some of the country knows it, then the rest of the country should know it. It's sort of that right to know. Yes,
not to be argumentative, but some things the press is asked to hold in confidence for various reasons.
National security.
Some things occasionally of a personal nature, for example, a kidnapping or something that might cause some harm. So I would point out that there are some exceptions.
There are exceptions, but I'm telling you the theory behind it. And I told you I'm not going to stand up here and argue it. Sorry.
I was just curious about your attitude about the relationship that Ronald Reagan has with the press corps at the White House. I've heard so many other reporters who are highly critical of his relationship, especially Sam Donaldson, and that he's very elusive with the press and that he has very few press conferences. And I was just curious how come your relationship seems to be so much more positive than other reporters?
No, I said we liked him, but that the adversarial relationship exists, and I told you about his side, but I think that we have complained, and I think you get a lot of the complaining, even though I don't think we make a practice of airing this in public, about his lack of access. I said it was my opening paragraph. And they go so far as to turn the helicopter on so he can't hear our questions when he leaves the White House to go to Camp David. No, he's stunningly inaccessible, and it bothers us. But, you know, we think that's pretty much inside baseball. That's our problem, and that's not necessarily a good subject for a CBS Evening News report today. But I think we wish he'd confront us more and take our questions. We think that he should be explaining his policies, his decision-making, that he should be accountable, and that the way to do that is to talk to the public through the press. And he doesn't very much. But that doesn't mean we don't like him, you see. There is there's kind of two relationships there. One is the professional one, and then there's the personal one. I do speak for myself, though, not for Sam.
Mrs. Stahl, it seems that the presidency is becoming a popularity contest. How can we attract the best people to this job, not necessarily the person that looks best on television, and what role can the media play in that?
Well, my own personal feeling is that Nixon showed it in the 1960 campaign, and now Mondale's shown it in '84, and that is that if you don't learn the skills that it takes to be a good candidate on television, that you are not going to be successful. And I think what we have to do is very little in that respect. Anybody who wants to run for the presidency is probably going to have to take television lessons. I think it's a fact of life. I don't think it's going to change. And I was surprised that Mondale, frankly, didn't appreciate that more, given what happened to Nixon in 1960. And I don't think it is going to change. I mean, that is the avenue through which people get their information now about campaigning. And so you have to learn to communicate the best you can with what exists. And I don't think there's going to be much change in that. I just
But don't we sort of scare off the people that
Yes,
may be better
Yes, we do.
in favor of the people that want to tell us what we want to hear.
we do, but it's not going to change, I don't think. So those people who want to be president are going to have to go and take television lessons. It's not that hard. I know, I covered a campaign in '82. Somebody was running for governor. And I interviewed him on camera. It wasn't live, it was on tape. And I said, well, could you explain your economic recovery plan for the state? It's a state with a lot of unemployment. And he said, Ms. Stahl, I have produced a paper 273 pages long explaining my economic recovery program. And I said, well, could you just sort of put it in a nutshell? And he said, Ms. Stahl, if I have to explain my 273 economic report in a 20-second soundbite for television, then I'll be frank with you, I don't want to be governor. And I thought to myself, and you won't be. And he wasn't. I do think you have to understand that you're communicating with the public that way, and you have to learn, political candidates have to learn that. I don't see how you avoid it. Do you see? I mean, where did you go? I mean, did you see how you avoid it? I don't even see him up there. Boy, did he take off. Where are we?
Ms. Stahl, just a question of curiosity. What is your professional opinion of Sam Donaldson and his reporting abilities?
You're going to be really surprised. I think he's one of the finest reporters in Washington. I like him very much. He's one of my dear friends, and he is a gentle, sweet person. I know how he comes across because he has that great booming voice and he asks great, tough questions, but he is a lovely person. It's the truth. I don't say that about everybody either. Are we finished? Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a lecture and a question and answer period with CBS News White House correspondent Lesley Stahl, speaking in the series of Landon lectures on public issues at Kansas State University. The broadcast was originated by Extension Radio Television Film. Supervisors and I'm Ralph Titus, and this is the K-State Radio Network.